Okay, so today we're tackling this book that's kind of infamous, I guess you could say, The Ego in Its Own by Max Stirner.
Yeah.
And it came out a while ago, I think 1844, so, really old.
Mm.
But the thing about it is it's had this like weird influence on a lot of different thinkers and movements.
Yeah.
We wouldn't necessarily think that a book from that time would be so important to
Right.
like the development of
It's one of those things that like you kind of look back and
Yeah.
you see that it's everywhere, but it's hard to see when you're kind of in the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And it influenced Marx,
Mm-hmm.
it influenced individualist anarchists, especially here in America,
Right.
like Benjamin Tucker with his journal Liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And some people even draw lines to Nietzsche, although that's a little bit more debated.
Yeah, Nietzsche's tough because Nietzsche, was a pretty well-read guy, but he never really
Mm-hmm.
cites Stirner directly. So,
Yeah.
makes you wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting how this, relatively obscure work could spark such different, even opposite reactions.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it really shows, I think, how radical Stirner's philosophy is.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, Marx felt like he had to engage with it
Yeah.
at length, in the German ideology,
Yeah.
really shows that it was a big deal in the world of ideas at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're going to be using excerpts from the Cambridge University Press edition of The Ego in Its Own,
Okay.
edited by David Leopold. And this is a really cool edition because it puts Stirner's work into the context of Western political thought,
Right.
which I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, you really need to see the bigger picture
Yeah.
to understand what Stirner was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of zoom out, you can see Stirner's work as a really powerful attack on what people at the time thought were the, acceptable ways of thinking about the world and, the way society was structured.
Right.
He was basically challenging, the Hegelian left,
Yeah.
which is funny because he came out of that movement himself.
Yeah.
So the Hegelian left was this group of intellectuals who were trying to use the ideas of this philosopher Hegel
Right.
to bring about some kind of radical social change.
Okay.
And Stirner's work, it kind of caused a crisis
Mm-hmm.
for these thinkers and forced them to re-examine some of their basic assumptions.
Yeah.
And of course, it was later picked up by individualist anarchists,
Mm-hmm.
which shows, how appealing it was to people who were looking for alternatives to, state power.
Yeah. So our mission today is to kind of pull out some of the key insights from Stirner's often outrageous
Right.
arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to kind of dig into his views on things that we usually just take for granted,
Yeah.
like mind spirit, the sacred even selflessness.
Right.
So get ready for a real thought-provoking perspective on your own life and how you relate to the world. Okay, so let's start with this idea of discovering mind,
Okay.
which Stirner talks about a lot, and this is one of his kind of core points.
Yep.
And he says that discovering mind is the first step toward real self-discovery.
Okay.
It's about rejecting this, the worship of the divine, the powers above, as he puts it.
So it's a decisive move away from this idea that,
Yeah.
there are these, higher beings controlling our lives.
Right.
And instead it's about realizing that we have the power to think for ourselves.
Right.
And to shape our own destiny.
Mm-hmm. And he talks about moving from just passively accepting the world as it is to actively engaging with it intelligently,
Yeah.
Using your mind to understand.
Yeah, he uses a great image of, shifting from just kind of like staring at the world
Yeah.
to looking at it intelligently with Geist, which translates to mind or spirit.
Right.
And it's like, having this intellectual awakening.
Yeah.
Right? Suddenly you realize that you don't have to just blindly accept things as they are.
Just taking off a pair of, glasses that were distorting your vision, and suddenly you can see everything clearly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like seeing the world for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And this raises a really interesting question about
Yeah.
authority.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where does authority come from?
Mm-hmm.
And Stirner, he rejects all these traditional sources of authority, even familial ones.
Right.
So he questions this idea that, just because someone's your parent or your sibling,
Yeah.
that they automatically deserve your reverence.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that, influence should be based on reason,
Right.
not on biology.
Okay.
And he even goes so far as to say that, parents and siblings can be like born again as intellectual powers,
Oh, wow.
meaning that their influence is now based on their ability to reason,
Okay.
not on their blood ties.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because you can connect this directly to your own life. Like, think about those times when you kind of woke up intellectually
Right.
and started questioning everything you'd been taught.
Exactly.
Stirner is laying the foundation for a really radical kind of individual freedom
Yeah,
that's rooted in thinking for yourself.
absolutely. Yeah.
So building on this idea of discovering the mind,
Okay.
Stirner contrasts the young person
Mm-hmm.
who discovers themselves as spirit
Okay.
and gets kind of lost in these big general ideals
Right.
with the person who kind of achieves a second self-discovery
Mm-hmm.
and finds himself as an embodied spirit.
Right.
And so the key here is the shift from, abstract ideas
Mm-hmm.
to the concrete reality of the individual.
So the young person,
Yeah.
they get all caught up in these big abstract ideas like God, Fatherland, mankind,
Mhm.
and they lose their individual spirit in the process.
Right.
But the more mature person,
Yeah.
the practical person,
Mm-hmm.
they focus more on themselves, and they're not so easily led astray by these external ideals.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too if we connect this to personal development. It's like going from this, naive idealism
Right.
to a more grounded self-awareness. It's about
Mhm.
balancing, the ideals that inspire us
Right.
with the reality of our own existence.
Exactly.
And I think that's something that everyone can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, have you felt yourself pulled between those two poles?
Yeah.
Between those external ideals
Yeah.
and that more grounded sense of self.
Definitely, it's like going from a theoretical understanding of the world to a lived experience of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's look at this idea of liberating the mind
Okay.
and Stirner's idea of the sacred.
Yeah.
And he traces this really interesting historical path here,
Right.
starting with the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so he talks about how, the Greek liberation of the mind started with the Sophists,
Right.
who were these kind of radical thinkers.
Yeah.
Who basically proclaimed the omnipotence of understanding.
Right. So the sophists, they really emphasize the power of human reason.
Yeah.
Right. They basically argued that human reason could grasp anything
Okay.
and that there were no limits
Okay.
to what we could understand,
Yeah.
which was a pretty radical idea at the time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then he brings in the skeptics who took this idea even further
Yeah.
and said that the heart should be unmoved by anything.
So it's about achieving this kind of emotional detachment from the world.
Right.
Think of it as like developing this unshakable inner calm,
Yeah.
no matter what's happening around you.
Right.
Right. So the world might be in chaos,
Yeah.
but you're at peace
Mm.
because you're not attached to anything.
Okay.
Okay.
And so this skepticism, Stirner argues, led to a feeling of being worldless.
Right. So by questioning all relationships,
Yeah.
right, and finding that there was no inherent truth
Yeah.
in any of them, these ancient thinkers came to see themselves as pure spirit, right, as beings without any inherent connections or a fixed world.
So it's like this really profound sense of intellectual and emotional independence.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's about breaking free from all those external attachments
Right.
and realizing that, your true self is this pure spirit
Okay.
that's not bound by anything.
Yeah. And then he talks about how the Romans, like Horace and Cicero
Right.
kind of adopted this more practical philosophy. And he also mentions the Epicureans and the Stoics who offered different ways of kind of dealing with the world.
So they were all about finding ways to live a good life.
Yeah.
Right in the midst of all this chaos.
Right.
But they still, they still acknowledged the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? They didn't completely reject it.
Right. But Stirner says that the skeptics, they went all the way. They
Yeah.
completely cut ties with the world.
Right. So thinkers like Timmaeman
Yeah.
and Pyrrhot,
Mm.
they considered all relationships to be worthless and truthless.
Wow.
Right. So this led to concepts like ataraxia,
Okay.
which is that unmovedness of the heart,
Mm-hmm.
and aphasia,
Okay.
which signifies both speechlessness
Okay.
and an inward retreat.
Interesting.
Right. So the world held no truth for them.
Mm-hmm.
So they just withdrew from it.
Okay.
Right.
And then Stirner makes this really bold claim.
Okay.
He says that the Christian loved spirit
Mm-hmm.
is actually nothing.
Wow.
A lie, in his words.
Okay.
And this is where his critique starts to really sting.
Yeah, right, because he's taking aim
Yeah.
at one of the most fundamental concepts of Christianity, right? This idea of the spirit.
Right.
And he's saying that it's a lie.
And so he defines spirit not as some kind of inherent substance,
Right.
but as something that creates a spiritual world.
So it only exists
Yeah.
when it's creating something spiritual.
Okay.
Right. So it's like saying a painter isn't a painter
Yeah.
unless they're actively painting.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then he gets into this idea of the sacred.
Okay.
And he defines the sacred as truth.
Truth.
It's eternal truth.
Okay.
That kind of sanctifies those who are filled by it.
Okay.
And he stresses that the sacred is not something that you can sense.
Right.
It's for faith.
It's for the spirit.
The spirit.
It's something that you believe in.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can, see or touch or taste.
Right. Right. And so what's important here is that,
Yeah.
this non-sensory nature of the sacred, it exists in the realm of belief,
Right.
of the spiritual.
Exactly.
And Stirner points out how difficult it is to set aside the sacred,
Yeah.
even when it seems human.
Right.
Right. So he distinguishes between, unearthly sacred things and earthly sacred things. But he argues that the underlying principle, something more important than everything, remains
It's still there.
Yeah, and this is really key to understanding his later critique of morality.
Right, because morality becomes this new kind of sacred thing that people start to worship.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so if the sacred is this realm of spiritual truth,
Okay.
then Stirner says that religion is about knowing and acknowledging essences.
Right.
And this, he says, leads to a very spooky place.
It's a place.
The realm of essences and spooks.
Yeah.
So he defines religion as being preoccupied with essences, with these, these abstract, non-material entities.
Right. So you got your Platonic forms,
Yeah.
your essences of things.
Right.
And Stirner's saying that this creates a world that's filled with spooks and ghosts. Right? These ideas that take on a life of their own and they start to control us.
Right.
And so he gives the example of the Christian struggle to understand the corporeal ghost.
Oh, yeah.
Right? The embodied spirit of Christ.
Yeah.
And this soul-torturing contradiction of the divine and human natures.
So it's like they can't figure out how to reconcile this abstract spiritual idea with the physical world.
Exactly. It's like, how can God be both fully God and fully human?
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and if we connect this to society, Stirner shows how this idea of the sacred, it permeates even these seemingly secular institutions.
Yeah.
So he uses the example of jurors and policemen operating based on oaths of office that are considered religiously binding.
Right. So even though we think of these legal systems as being secular, they're actually underpinned by these, spiritual concepts.
It really makes you think about the unspoken beliefs that shape our world.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so now Stirner looks at morality versus piety.
Okay.
And the roots of liberalism. And he argues that morality could only oppose piety after this kind of major shift in thinking.
So there had to be this revolt
Yeah.
against the idea of order, right? And this rejection of this personal absolute Lord.
Yeah.
Right. So basically people had to start challenging the traditional religious authorities.
Right.
Before morality could emerge as a separate thing.
Okay, so liberalism is how morality kind of gained its independence.
Yeah.
And he says that, this first showed up as citizenship.
Right.
And kind of weakened religious institutions.
Yeah. So instead of being primarily members of a church,
Yeah.
people started to see themselves as citizens of a state.
Right.
Right. And that shifted the balance of power.
And so he contrasts piety, where God is the lawgiver, with morality, where man is determining himself through reason and this essence of man.
So it's a shift from divine command to human reason as the basis for ethics. Right. So instead of saying, God says this is right and this is wrong. Morality says, well, human reason tells us this is right, this is wrong.
Okay, and that's a really important distinction.
It is, yeah.
Right, because in morality, the focus shifts to human reason and this idea that ethical laws come from the very nature of being human.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a much more human-centered view of ethics,
right,
compared to the God-centered framework of piety.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, Stirner really goes after this idea of being good.
Okay.
In his discussion of the egoist versus the good. And he brings up this really interesting example of the good Romans.
Oh, yeah.
And so he describes these good Romans who obeyed authority,
Right.
but then they praised this immoral act
Yeah.
of a rebel.
Right.
And so it really highlights this kind of contradiction.
Right. Where does the courage to rebel come from if you're always just being good?
Right. Right.
Right. It's like, are you only allowed to rebel if you're already a bad person?
And Stirner's claim is pretty wild.
It is, yeah.
He says that revolution is always immoral.
Right.
And it requires not being good.
So you have to step outside of the established moral framework.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to make any real change.
Right.
And it's interesting because he even brings up Nero.
Yeah.
Right. Who was considered a very bad emperor.
Yeah.
By the standards of his time.
Yeah.
And Stirner's point is that, judging figures solely through the lens of morality might actually be hiding other ways of seeing their actions.
Okay.
So it makes you wonder, were some of history's villains actually, maybe not so bad.
Right, right.
If we look at them from a different perspective.
Okay. And he doesn't shy away from this clash between egoism and morality?
No, he doesn't.
Right.
He's very clear about that.
He talks about the hard fist of morality against egoism.
Right, and that's really the core tension, I think, in his work.
It's this tension between, self-interest and social expectations.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about selfishness versus unselfishness, because this is another one of those things where Stirner kind of turns everything on its head.
Yeah.
And so he argues that even actions that seem to be for others can actually be rooted in self-interest.
Okay.
And he gives the example of O'Connell.
Right.
And so what's really insightful here is that Stirner is saying that, even when people are working for a cause that seems to benefit others, like O'Connell was doing, the underlying motivation can still be a form of self-interest.
So they're still working toward an end that they consider to be their own.
Right.
Right. So they might be working for the benefit of their nation.
Yeah.
Or for the benefit of their religion. Or for the benefit of some other group.
Right.
But they're still doing it because it ultimately serves their own interests.
Okay.
In some way.
So how does he define unselfishness then?
Right. So Stirner says that unselfishness is when that end ceases to be our end and it becomes this fixed idea that possesses us. So it's not about, acting for others.
Yeah.
It's about being dominated by an idea or a cause to the point where your own desires are secondary.
Okay, so it's like becoming a vessel for this sacred zeal.
Exactly.
Leading to that, here I stand, I can do no other mentality.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he makes this distinction between feelings that are imparted to us through education and feelings that are aroused within us, which he sees as the truly egoistic feelings.
Right.
And so this is a really important point.
It is, yeah. Because
Stirner's saying that, a lot of our emotional life is shaped by external forces, not by our own experience.
Right, so it's like we're being programmed to feel certain ways.
Yeah, and he gives examples like, veneration for God or prince, the inviolability of morality, shuddering at evil.
Right. These are all things that are drilled into us from a young age.
It really makes you question, your emotional responses.
It does. Yeah. Like how much of what I'm feeling is actually genuine.
Right.
And how much of it is just, what I've been taught to feel.
Right. Right. And what do you think about this idea that, so much of what we feel is just programming?
Well, it makes you wonder what the point of education is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, should education be about instilling certain feelings? Right. Or should it be about, creating an environment where people can develop their own responses to the world?
Yeah. And so if many of our feelings are kind of instilled in us by society, Stirner takes this even further and starts to critique some of these grand narratives that have shaped Western thought.
Right.
And he introduces this really controversial idea about Caucasian Mongolism.
Okay.
Now, I want to be clear here. This is a historical argument that reflects 19th century views, not necessarily what we believe today.
Right. Yeah, this is one of those parts of Stirner's work that, we have to read with a critical eye and understand the historical context.
Yeah. And so he explains this Caucasian Mongolism as the industrious creation of a heaven of custom and ordinance.
So it's about establishing these rigid social structures.
Yeah.
Right? And these rules that govern every aspect of life.
Yeah, and he talks about how, Caucasian heaven storming involves overturning these customs to establish new and better ones.
Right, so it's about progress.
Yeah.
Right.
But he criticizes this as still being tainted by Mongolism because it's just improving existing structures.
Right.
It's creating new heavens instead of dismantling the very concept of a heaven.
You're still trapped in this framework of having a heaven.
Yeah, and he sees this, this constant rebuilding, like the Jewish heaven, the Christian heaven.
The Protestant heaven.
The Protestant heaven.
Right, it's just replacing one set of rules with another.
Yeah, and he says that true, overcoming this Mongolism would involve the complete downfall of heaven, of customs, of the emotional man in their respective worlds.
Right. So it's about getting rid of all these abstract ideals and external authority.
A realm of spirits.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Now he makes this distinction between egoists in the usual sense.
Okay.
Those who are just looking for an advantage.
Right.
And the truly self-sacrificing.
Oh, wow.
Which is a little bit counterintuitive.
It is, yeah.
And so he argues that the truly self-sacrificing individual isn't someone who's denying their interests for others.
Right.
But someone who's giving everything for a single object, will, or passion.
So it could be love.
Yeah.
It could be ambition. Greed.
Pleasure. Right.
Any of these things.
So the lover who forsakes everything for their beloved.
Right.
The ambitious person who's driven by their goals.
These are the truly self-sacrificing in Stirner's view.
Because they're ruled by this passion to which they sacrifice everything else.
Okay.
Right?
So it's a very different take on self-sacrifice.
It is.
Than, the traditional view of denying yourself for the sake of others.
Absolutely.
Okay. So moving on, Stirner discusses philanthropy.
Okay.
And this spook of man.
Man with a capital M.
Yeah, with a capital M.
Right.
And he says that, dropping personal concern leads to this kind of abstract friendliness.
Right. So it's like you care more about the idea of humanity than you do about actual humans.
Right.
It's like you're more concerned with this abstract concept than you are with the flesh and blood people.
Yeah. And he then touches on the middle class.
Okay.
And their relationship with idealism. And he notes their rejection of Robespierre's idealism.
Right.
When it started to clash with their self-interest.
Right. So they were all for lofty goals.
As long as it didn't cost them any money.
Right. Right.
But as soon as Robespierre started, threatening their gains, they turned on him.
Yeah, and he contrasts this with the priestly call to self-denial.
Right.
It's like, cast away everything and follow me. And the middle class is like, well,
Yeah, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Let's be practical here.
Yeah, and he gives the example of Ananias and Sapphira as those who are maintaining this kind of half-clerical, half-worldly behavior, serving both God and mammon.
So they're trying to have both ways.
Yeah, it's about the difficulty of fully committing to abstract ideals when you have these real world interests at stake.
Exactly. It's like you can't serve two masters.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so now Stirner looks at Luther Protestantism and hierarchy.
Okay.
And so he explains Luther's view that truth being a thought is only for the thinking man.
Right. So only those who are capable of deep thought
can
really understand God.
Okay.
And Luther's famous phrase here is only the apprehend the like.
Right.
So, if you're not a thinking person, you're not going to be able to grasp the truth of God.
Okay. So it's like a very elitist view of religion.
It is, yeah.
Right. But Stirner argues that Protestantism, while breaking this, medieval hierarchy, was actually a reformation and a reinvigoration of hierarchy.
Wow.
Making it more inward and more powerful.
So it's like they got rid of the Pope.
Oh, yeah. But they just replaced him with the Bible.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And with this internalized sense of duty.
Yeah, so it's like this really subtle argument about how, these attempts to reform can actually end up